Welcome to the Pandaverse. We've got Jule Selbo with us today, and we'll be discussing her novel, Find Me in Florence. It's available on Amazon. It's also available through pandamoonpublishing.com.
Okay, hi everyone. This is really fun for me to do today. My book, Find Me in Florence, was begun when I was living in Florence. I was teaching screenwriting there for my university that I teach at. And I had about 12 screenwriting students over there with me. But I had some free time and I always wanted to write a novel. And I always tell my students, you got to write where you are right now. And so I thought, well, I should take my own advice. So I sat down and I was looking around Florence. I was at Cafe Gili, which is a wonderful place right in the one of the main piazzas. And I had just had a little tiff with my husband. And so I was like going, oh my God, why did I marry that man? This is crazy. So my book started from there. And so the very beginning of the book, which I'm not going to read because it's Stan, who's the husband of Lynn Bennett. He was supposed to come to Florence with her this year. And at the last minute, like 10 minutes before she leaves for the airport, he calls her from his law office and says that he can't get away. And so she has to go to Florence this year by herself. And they had gone together for the last 3 years. So I'm going to start a couple pages in, just 3 pages in, where Lynn is sitting at Cafe Gili all by herself. And so this is Find Me in Florence. I should also say that for those of you who have traveled to Florence, I think the book will bring back a lot of memories. And as you know, it's a beautiful city. If you've never been to Florence, I've been told that the book really brings it to life. And it is just a magical, historic, fabulous place to be, and very, very Italian. They work very hard to keep it very non-touristy, even though it's one of the most popular destinations. So here's Lynn Bennett sitting at Cafe Gili at near the beginning of the book. So here I am at the Cafe Gili in the heart of Florence, alone, ordering my morning cafe Americano. My mother's journal, the leather-bound pages that I climbed into the attic to retrieve after her funeral, is in my bag. Its weight is a reminder of my promise to myself. Follow her memories, rebuild her moments. She asked me, find me in Florence. The tuxedo-jacketed waiter delivers my cafe Americano in a beautiful silver pot along with the cornetto semplice on delicate china. Most people here call the cornetto semplice a croissant. They are shaped the same, but I know not to expect the French flaky, buttery crunch and lightness. The consistency of the Italian cornetto is closer to a brioche, doughier and yeastier, and most are topped with a slightly sticky orange-scented glaze, and some are filled with custard or Nutella or jam. Best to hold it with the paper napkin it's served on, or commit to sucking on fingers for the rest of the day. And I don't want to do that in Florence. It's a sophisticated city, not a walk around, suck on your sticky fingers city. Mi scusi, signorina, perdone. Startled, I looked up. The early sun obscures his face. He's tall. He holds a scarf in his hands, my scarf. Signorina, è suo? Is this yours? Yes, it's the inexpensive, bright red scarf I bought at a kiosk yesterday for €5 on a rare, it's my birthday, live a little, dare to shine whim. Oh, it must have slipped off my bag and fallen to the ground. I take the scarf. Grazie, grazie. He sits at another table. Un espresso, por favore, he says to the passing waiter. Because no one tips in Italy, unless it's an extra special experience. Waiters rarely put forth any effort to please the customer. A person's lucky if service is attentive in any way. However, this waiter nods at this tall, dark-haired man in a white shirt and tie, and they exchange a friendly greeting. He might be a regular patron. Sport coat and dark jeans, polished leather shoes, a leather briefcase. There is so much leather in Florence. on people's backs, on their feet, in shops, in kiosks, some expensive and buttery soft, some rough and stiff and inexpensive. The city smells of leather. Across the piazza, street vendors push their carts into place, begin to set out their wares. I sigh, I think of last year. Stan and I sat at this table. Stan ordered the American breakfast at Jule, eggs and toast. Italians use eggs to bind their frittatas, or they hard boil them and slice them onto sandwiches. They don't torture and sear eggs and then pile them in a pale yellow mound on a plate for a morning meal. Stan laughed. It's my Nikes and the scrambled eggs. Screams USA. At least you don't wear a baseball hat, Bermuda shorts, and knee-high tube socks. Someone has to see you eating breakfast to get the first American hint. You hold these Italians up too high, Lynn. Things take too long to get done here. I appreciate that they know how beautiful the old is. In the last 2 years, Stan had carved out a week from his work schedule to visit me in Florence during the month-long Writers Now seminar. This visit will be different. An entire month witnessing Florence through my alone lens, not clouded by how Stan sees it. Cafe Gili is in the Piazza Carousel. That's not its real name. It's what I call it because with a multitude of piazzas around every corner, it's hard for a relative newbie to Florence to keep them straight. Its official name is the Piazza della Repubblica. I like to imagine the site as it once was, an old Roman forum with a temple dedicated to Mars, the city's patron god before Christianity was adopted. Then, in subsequent centuries, it was home to the Florence ghetto and a maze of shops called the Mercato Vecchio. Then it changed. It was gutted in a movement in the late 1800s called Risanamento. Risanamento in Italian means rehabilitation. Now, I view the high-end cafes, the hotels and shops that frame the square, the bustle of the well-heeled. I've taken tours with historians who put on sad, how could they have done such a thing, faces and claim that the risanamento of this historic piazza was not rehabilitation, but ruination, change. Unavoidable, perhaps. From here, it's a 5-minute walk to Florence's most famous bridge, the Ponte Vecchio, and a 5-minute walk in another direction to the Il Duomo di Firenze, the city's most famous cathedral. In the center of the Piazza della Repubblica is the beautiful antique carousel filled with brightly painted wooden horses. So it's easy to say, let's meet at the carousel. People know it. Its golden frame studded with sparkling, oversized faux gems, its gilded king's carriages, fresh flowers and pots, and the lilting accordion recordings of the Neapolitan ballads. If Paris is officially the city for lovers, Florence has to be a close second. I did read an article recently that named Las Vegas as a top city for lovers, and that made me wonder about the very notion of romance. I head towards the Ponte Vecchio and turn left and walk along the Arno, the river that runs through Florence. It's moving fast today, the result of a sudden rain last night. It's early, the start of the day, but lovers are already taking selfies, kissing and canoodling on the stone walls between water and the city. The mediocre violinist from last year and the year before, his instrument case open at his feet to attract tourist coins, plays the Godfather love theme. This is the only tune he seems to know. Professors, students, shop workers, dog walkers, businessmen and women hurry to their destinations. A tour bus pulls up and a gaggle of Chinese tourists descend onto the street to march behind a guide waving a bright green flag through the air. I lift my bag onto the river wall, feel the shape of my mother's journal within it. I gaze at the Arno, think of the time my mother spent here 50 years ago. Her stories of how the Arno catastrophically flooded Florence in 1966. Priceless Roman and Renaissance artwork and irreplaceable ancient books and maps and prints and centuries-old letters housed in the city's museums and churches and libraries were in danger. One day, when she was helping me streak my dark curly hair with orange highlights for my junior high Halloween party, and we were waiting for the sprayed-on color to dry, she took a large book off the shelf in the hallway. We sat on the edge of the bathroom's tub and studied the map of the Tuscan region, and she explained how the La Penna and La Vene dams in Valderno, 34 miles away, ruptured during heavy rains and sent over 70,000 cubic feet of water per second towards Florence, traveling at almost 40 miles per hour. Think about it, Lynn, she said later as we drove across the Cross Island Parkway in Queens so she could drop me off at the party. Water was coming into the city as fast as we are driving right now. I was barely listening. I was worried about the orange streaks in my hair, I was worried that the orange streaks in my hair were too scary stupid for my Halloween party and that my dance moves would suck. She showed me the photographs she kept in a small wooden box in her closet. Photos of herself as one of the mud angels, the angels of the mud, Gli Angeli del Fango. As the river rose and fell, volunteers arrived from around the world to wade through the detritus in attempts to rescue Florence's rich history. My mother was in the photographs, part of the Mud Angel rescue teams. This was before she married my father and settled in New York. At least 3 million books, Lynn, and probably more. And over 1,500 works of art, probably more, were damaged or destroyed in that flood. We wanted to save everything, but we couldn't. She sighed, so many lost treasures. After her first stroke, when I sat next to her on our comfy living room couch near the warmth of the fire my father had built in the fireplace, we thumbed through her picture books on the flood. She spoke slower and slurred a bit, forgot some words, but I could tell memories were dancing in her head. She told me how hospitals were evacuated and needed medicines were lost. We paged through to scrutinize Donatello's 1454 wooden statue of Magdalene Penitent. She was in the baptistry of the San Giovanni. This, she traced the concave lines of the emaciated body of Mary Magdalene, the long, pained, distraught, disturbing face in the photograph. She is starved, see? From living in the desert where she meditated, hating the world, hating herself, trying to forgive after the crucifixion of Christ. This statue of her was almost buried in muddy water, but she withstood. The water rose to her large hands. See, they're awfully big. See how they're pressed to her chest, always praying? My mother said it was sad because the flood could have been avoided. The Arno, Florence's lifeblood, had flooded to devastation levels before. The first one recorded was in the 12th century, and then again in the 13th and 16th centuries. We studied reproductions of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings. In the early 1500s, Lynn, he drew up these plans for river control, but no one paid attention. He wasn't popular with the rulers, the Medicis. Da Vinci was flamboyant, Lynn, and even though Florence was relatively open, seems there was a don't ask, don't tell sort of policy. Da Vinci may have flaunted too much, she sighed, told me how even Michelangelo, decades later, designed dams, but no projects were ever brought to fruition. Change did not happen. And so in 1966, Florence experienced great devastation. And now I'm here, 50 years after the fact, feeling the outline of her journal in my bag. It holds clues to stories she never told me, that I missed the telling of, photos she had never shared with me. I look down into the river, fight the wave of sadness mixed with guilt. I see myself sitting next to her in the hospital bed, her thin, dry, beautiful handwriting on the pad of paper we used to communicate. She wrote, honeymoon suitcase. Attic? Bring? I told her, of course I would. She continued her effort. Find me in Florence. But I didn't get to the attic. I didn't bring the suitcase or those memories to her in time. End of chapter 1.
Oh, that was really good.
When I was there, the first year, it was, they were getting ready for the 50th anniversary of the Mud Angels. As I say in the book, this group of volunteers who just basically appeared. You couldn't fly into Florence because of the storms and the rain and the flooding. So they would go to Pisa, they would go to Rome, hitchhiking any way they could. And they got to Florence and they were handed big rubber waders. And they just said, start digging in the mud and the water and see what you can find.
I know you mentioned Nutella. It's a strange thing to pull out of all that. But, I'm told that it's really popular over there. I don't know if people know the history of Nutella.
Well, it's basically their peanut butter, how we eat peanut butter here.
Right. It's It's chocolate with, I think it's hazelnut, and it's
Yeah.
blended together. And it was created back during World War II because there was a shortage of chocolate around the world, and they were trying to stretch the chocolate as much as they could. So it kind of got invented because of World War II. So that's maybe one of the good things that came out of the war. I don't know. One of the few good things. And I'm told that it's so popular over there that people buy it in large jars.
Oh, huge.
Yeah. So.
And for me, it's kind of nice as a desserty kind of thing, but they do it for breakfast. They put it on bread for breakfast, and it's sweet. It's chocolate, but it's sweet chocolate, and then the hazelnut.
Well, a lot of the things that we think of as breakfast foods here in America are maybe foods that are served toward dinner in a lot of the European countries. I know in France that, you know, if you make an omelet, that's a dinner item. It's not really a breakfast item. But
yeah, it's interesting because the French think corn on the cob is just so déclassé, and they would never even think of it. It's food for horses. And we find it to be such a fun summer treat.
Well, I'm told it has dubious nutritional value for us. So you got quite a diverse background. You write historical fiction novels.
I wrote 2 historical fiction, one on John Cabot,
Right.
Giovanni Cabato, who was born in Genoa at the same time as Columbus. They knew each other. And in 1497, he landed in Nova Scotia and came down, you know, through Maine, and some people think all the way to Georgia or maybe even Florida. And, you know, obviously 1492, Columbus came the southern way, but Giovanni Cabato changed his name to John Cabot so that the King of England would feel more comfortable letting him be the patron for his voyages under the flag of England.
Right.
And then my other one is on Laura Bassi, who was an amazing woman. She was born in 1711, and she was a scientist. She was, I think, you know, who knows, but I can't imagine after doing all this research and writing about her that she wasn't a genius. And in Bologna, Italy, which was one of the big centers of education, women couldn't go to school. They had to be tutored at home if they could be at all. And she had to fight to get involved in the university, and she got very involved in electricity, and she mentored Volta and Galvani and was pen pals with Ben Franklin and Voltaire, and she was an amazing woman.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom at the time, I don't think, you know, most people haven't studied the subject, but the conventional wisdom at the time was, since women's brains are physically smaller than male brains, that it's a waste to give them a higher education.
I know.
And that was, I mean, of course, we're enlightened enough now to know that that's not the case, because there's very many successful women around. And,
yeah,
but there were back then too, and a lot of them wrote, you know, incredible works, but they published them under a male name so that they could get them recognized.
And then in Asia, there was such a matriarchal society where the women were the rulers and the intelligentsia, and then there was a big shift, and so we're almost out of it, I think. You're
also an accomplished screenwriter, and you've also written plays. You're a playwright. So tell us a little bit about your background there.
Well, I started, you know, even as a kid, I guess I just love story, and I like to do research, and I like to build story around fact, historical fact or scientific fact or whatever. One of my favorite jobs in Hollywood was I worked with George Lucas on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. And that was the perfect job, I think, for me, because it was so research heavy. The conceit of the show is that we tried to keep everything as historically correct, except you have this imaginary character thrown into the middle of it. So he found himself in the midst of all these historical craziness. And I worked on that for 3.5 years. And it was just so much fun. And I find, like, when I look at my work, I find that when I can kind of like focus in on a historical fact or a scientific nugget or mathematical nugget or something like that, it just kind of frees me to imagine what happened in and around it. Well, even as a kid, I was writing plays, putting them on my garage with my friend, and then I kept writing plays in high school and college. A couple of them got put on, and then when I moved to New York after graduate school, I had a couple of plays done off Broadway that got some attention of some TV shows. So I was hired to write for Tales from the Dark Side, which is George Romero's show, and then his show called Monster Stew. So that was amazing. And then I got a couple of gigs in Hollywood writing movies, and was hired to write on television shows, and it was just the best. It was just, I can't believe how lucky I was, and it was so much fun, and I worked with so many amazing people. And then about 3 years ago, I just said, I've always wanted to be a novelist, and plays were my biggest passion. It's time for me to move from California to Portland, Maine, and focus on doing that.
You've also taught at the university out in California, and you've written textbooks that are used by people all around the world on screenwriting and the subject of screenwriting. And I know you're doing a seminar next week on screenwriting. So talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, I'm doing a seminar next week. It's a 2-week seminar, but you can take it 1 week at a time. But I think people are signed up for 2 weeks at this really wonderful college up here called Maine Media College. What makes it so great, and I have no idea how they make it work, but they keep the classes really, really small. So I'll have 5 students, and we'll just be working really, really individually to make sure that they get their projects in the shape that they want them. So it's an exciting way to work. When I'm at the University of Cal State University, the classes are big, and so you don't get that individual attention, even though you try to work with students individually. So this thing at Maine Media College is a real treat.
What's next in your career for writing fiction?
Well, I just kind of started celebrating a little bit today, even though I still have lots of work to do. But I finished this. I bet my favorite genre to read is detective fiction and crime fiction. And I'll read historical fiction, and I'll read, literary fiction and stuff like that. But what I do to relax and to just kind of have fun is to read detective fiction. So I thought, well, I want to write one of those. Well, they're hard. They're very
yeah. Yeah, it's one of my favorite genres to read too, and I've dabbled in writing it several times. And of course, the stuff that I write, there's always a element of mystery in it anyway, because you got to make the story interesting. But it's a challenge, especially getting the exact procedural things down, that the police departments use.
Well, Portland, Maine is the home of amazing writers. I didn't realize that when I moved here. We have so many Pulitzer Prize winners and National Book Award winners, and crime fiction novelists, and cozy fiction, cozy mysteries, and all things. And so there's a lot of people to check in with, and there's a lot of retired cops who have turned to writing crime fiction, so they're very helpful. But yeah, the getting the procedural correct, but also laying in the clues so that the audience can be ahead sometimes, but behind sometimes, and
throwing in the red herrings.
Oh my goodness! But so today I finished up like pretty solid first draft. So I'm gonna futz with it for another week or so, and then give it to a couple of readers that have said that they would read it for me and tear me apart and that kind of stuff. And so
That's
yeah,
exciting.
it's there.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people go to Maine so that they're forced to write during the winter when they're snowed in. just
Maybe that's
just a guess. I mean, I'm here in Vegas, and it's kind of like the summer here is when you don't do anything. I mean, it's like 115 right now outside. You know, you go out in it, it's still hot. I mean, I walk to the mailbox and I can feel my skin burning. No, and I'm really fair complected anyway. So I mean,
and aren't you from Ohio?
Yeah, I grew up in Ohio in the Midwest, and I used to get sunburned all the time. I grew up on a farm, and would be out baling hay, and I would get sunburned really bad.
Well, you know, just to go back to the screenwriting
Yeah.
stuff, because you know, I've been working on movies and television. I did, you know, series like Melrose Place and Life Goes On and Flash and Space Above and Beyond. And I did a lot of work for Disney I did Hunchback of Notre Dame Part 2. I did Cinderella 2. I did Ariel's Beginning and in working so much with that, and then I was asked to teach a lot of screenwriting seminars, and it just became very clear to me that it all comes back to character and story, and that plot is character, character is plot. And so that's one of my books that is used in a lot of universities. And then the one that I did my PhD, my dissertation, was on film genre, because I became very fascinated with the fact that each genre basically has its components, and you can mess with them, but unless you mess with them in a way that the audience knows you're messing with them, the people who are like horror fans, vampire fans, zombie fans, if you don't have some of those classic components right, just toss it. So film genre and story structure became kind of my big things. But I did do a history of female screenwriters from 1896, which is basically the start of commercial film, to 2015, because that's when it was published, with a writer in London. And we went from country to country to country. And it's the book is like 750 pages long, and we because we were all academics at that time, so there were people, you know, Swedes who wrote about the Swedes and Greeks who wrote about the Greeks, and then we put it all together, and then we also wrote a lot of it ourselves that we couldn't find writers for. So it's that kind of combination of history and love of story I keep, I guess, coming back to.
Yeah, it's the same with writing fantasy or science fiction. There's conventions that you have to use and structural elements, and the purists will tear you apart if your book doesn't follow that.
I know. I mean, I love your books, and the fantasy element. That's what's I mean, that's always pushing the edge. So you have so much more freedom doing that.
You have such a diverse background, and you know, bringing all that stuff together, and people that aspire to being great screenwriters or great writers. What sort of advice would you give them to guide them in the proper direction, you know, from your experience in getting into the industry?
Well, you know, it's I have you know, obviously, since I have students still, and I see them, each of them struggling to find a way in. It's basically write, have tons of samples, keep sending things out. And then if you can, if you're in Chicago, LA, New York, Atlanta, one of the hubs, really try to work in any kind of production office or literary agent office, something where you're going to be meeting people and you know, very nicely try to share your scripts. But also, because the industry is the way it is now, and film production or video production, you know, people are doing it on their cell phones. You'll hear agents or managers say, well, yeah, go shoot it. And whereas when I was younger, that you couldn't go do that because it was just too expensive. You didn't have the right cameras and stuff like that. So it was much more of, okay, you're a writer, good, I need a writer, let's do this. Whereas now you have to prove yourself so many of your own ways, and they go, well, put it on YouTube, see if it'll make some money, and then we'll talk. It's more difficult, but it can happen. And it comes down to having a lot of work, getting better. And I sincerely believe you do get better. You know, it's not like you write a script and it could be brilliant, it could maybe need work. And so your next one is going to be the same. Every script, you're starting from scratch, but you do get better. You kind of learn things. And so keep writing, keep getting better, network, find a writer's group. It comes down to kind of who you end up meeting and who you, and so you can't sit at home and just write and send things out. That rarely works.
You have to motivate yourself. You have to be your own champion. You have to have a lot of confidence in yourself. And, you know, a lot of people are naturally introverted. There's a natural barrier there, and you have to get past that at some point. You have to be able to toot your own horn.
Yep. That's hard for writers. It's hard for a lot of people, but especially writers, because we're happiest when we're just writing, and the marketing is a whole different kettle of worms.
Probably the best thing I ever did was go into sales and, you know, work on talking to people and selling products. And what I learned there is that if you believe in a product, you're better able to sell it. You can almost sell it every time. So translating that into writing, you have to believe in your writing. You have to believe.
I tell clients and my students all the time that someone has to write it. It might as well be you.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, please, will you read my script? It's not very good, or, you know, let it out. Basically, believe in your work. You've got a voice, and someone's going to have. There's a lot of entertainment out there on television and in movies. Someone's got to write it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you got to be able to condense what you write into a pitch. I mean, all the stuff that you learned in high school, and you know, if you were lucky enough to study literature in college, you have to be able to dissect whatever you write in those terms, and, you know, pick up the key points. What's the conflict? You know, how does that translate to the antagonist and the protagonist? And, you know, you really have to work all that out in your mind. And, you know, even when you're writing it, you may not be aware of when you're writing it, but you're putting it in there because your writing imitates life. And you have to make it realistic for the person to be able to get into the book, into the storyline, and divorce their reality for the moment. You know, suspend their disbelief to enter into the fantasy that you're writing, or the
character has to have a problem. And they have to be trying to figure out how to get out of it or solve it. And
they have to grow as an evolution from the story. You know, they have to grow and develop and learn things in the process of the story. If your story doesn't have those elements, then it's not really conveying anything of value to the reader.
It's very interesting moving into prose and novels. I have a friend here in Maine. She's a very successful short story writer, and we're in a writers group together here. And she says she's always battling with herself, because she said, to me, the sentence is paramount. And she has great characters, and there's some story, but she really focuses on mood and sentences and finding the right word. Where I'm probably exactly the opposite. I really care about words and finding the right words, but I want that story to be like a freight, you know, like a speeding train. I want someone to be going, now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen? So it's good to be able to share our work, because we can kind of like talk to each other.
And maybe since your background's more with the media, you know, and writing for the media, everything from a visual context has to be stimulating and exciting, and has to keep driving it along. And I think that works well with your writing, in prose, because you have a good sense of that, and your story keeps moving along. And I think younger people who've grown up with TV and watching movies, um, and not so much following the books, they actually expect that to happen in the books.
Yeah, I don't know the history of prose literature as you do. But I guess I look at Hammett and Raymond Chandler, how those are moving, moving, moving. And then Michael Crichton, I always felt like when I was reading his books, I was also watching a movie, because they were
Right,
so cinematic
exactly.
fast. And I feel like that's what I aspire to. And I guess that's my voice, because everyone's going to have their own voice. And I
Right.
think that I always tell my students that the only person who can write your story is you. And they go, yeah, but that story's been told. And I go, no, it hasn't been told through your voice. And so you can, finding the way to get your voice on the paper. And then for screenwriters, the first way you're going to sell it is on paper. So you have to write it to pull the reader in. And then down the road, hopefully in production, you're still around to work on it.
Your book is enjoyable on so many different levels, because it's kind of like traveling to Italy, and actually being there, and smelling the smells, and hearing the people talk, and all the dynamic energy that is Italy. So it's like going on a vacation.
Thank you. Yeah, I loved writing it, and it's up for it's a finalist in the Chantellaine Awards for women's fiction and romance, and there is a very strong romance in there, and all my friends want to meet Matteo, this Italian guy. But the part, and I do love writing that part too. But the story of the Mud Angels is really, for me, and discovering what her mother went through as a young woman, as a Mud Angel. It was really fun to write that.